Abigail Thornfield pressed her dead husband's pocket watch against her chest and told herself she wouldn't cry again. She had cried enough. The dirt above Thomas's grave was barely settled, and already the bank's letter sat on her kitchen table like a loaded gun. 60 days to prove a widow could hold a ranch alone under a Montana summer sun hot enough to crack stone. She didn't know then that everything was about to change with a single knock at her door. If this story moves you, subscribe to the channel and follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The summer of 1878 came to Harlan County, Montana, like a punishment. The heat pressed down on the grassland from the first light of morning, baking the soil until it cracked in long, pale seams, and by noon, the air shimmered above the fence posts in waves that made everything in the distance look like it was drowning. The creek that ran along the eastern boundary of the Thornfield Ranch had dropped 2 feet since May. The well behind the house groaned every time Abigail worked the handle. The garden was fighting, but barely, and Abigail Thornfield was doing the same. She stood at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, 41 years old, 5'4", with hands that had gone rough and red from working alone since March. And she read the letter from Harlan County Bank for the 4th time that week. Not because she hoped the words had changed. They hadn't. She read it because she needed to feel the full weight of it. She needed to be angry enough to keep moving. 60 days, the letter said. Or we begin proceedings. She folded it exactly the way she'd found it, creased sharp at the edges, and slid it back under the flour tin, where she kept things she wasn't ready to throw away, but couldn't stand to look at. Thomas had been dead 4 months. The note on the ranch, a note he'd signed with his big looping handwriting the year before he got sick, was overdue. Thomas had always believed the cattle prices would come back up. Thomas had always believed things would work out. Thomas was wrong, and now he was in the ground behind the cottonwood tree, and Abigail was the one left holding the bill. She poured herself a coffee that had gone cold and drank it standing up. Through the front window, she could see the fence along the south pasture, sagging where one of the posts had rotted through. She needed wire. She needed feed. She needed a second set of hands, and probably a third, and the one hired man she'd been able to afford, old Del Sutter, who smelled like tobacco and horse liniment, and had worked for Thomas for 11 years, had taken a better-paying job over at the Callaway Spread 2 weeks ago. He hadn't apologized when he left. He'd just looked at her, the way everybody in town looked at her lately, with that careful, pitying expression that meant, "I don't think you're going to make it," and then he'd gotten on his horse and ridden south. Abigail set down the coffee cup harder than she meant to. The nearest town was Grover's Bend, 4 miles east, and she'd been into town twice since Thomas passed. Both times she'd heard the whispers before she could even get down off the wagon. Not loud whispers. The people of Grover's Bend weren't cruel enough to be loud about it, but they were consistent. Standing outside Delman's Dry Goods, gathered on the steps of the feed store, the same words floating just inside the edge of her hearing. "Poor woman. Can't hold it together. She'll sell by August, you mark my words. A widow alone out there in this heat, that ranch will be gone before harvest." She'd bought her flour and her salt and her nails, and she'd driven home without stopping to talk to anyone, because she didn't trust herself to be polite. And she had to be polite. She had no allies to spare. She was pulling on her work gloves, stiff with dried sweat, a hole forming at the right thumb when she heard it. A knock. 3 solid knocks, deliberate and unhurried, against her front door. Abigail straightened. She wasn't expecting anyone. The minister from First Baptist had come by 3 weeks ago with a pie, and had spent most of his visit hinting that the congregation would be willing to help manage her affairs if she needed guidance. An offer she had declined without using a single profane word, which she considered a personal achievement. The banker's man, a thin-shouldered fellow named Crouch, had ridden out twice already. She didn't need either of them on her porch this morning. She crossed to the door and opened it. The man standing on her porch was not someone she recognized. He was tall, a full head taller than her, with broad shoulders and a face that had spent a lot of time under a hard sun. His hat was dark with sweat along the band, and his shirt, though clean, had the look of a man who owned two of them and rotated carefully. He was holding his hat in both hands, turning it slowly in a gesture that might have been nerves or might have just been habit. His eyes were gray, steady, and tired in a way that wasn't just the heat. And standing just behind his left leg, pressed against him, like she was trying to disappear into his shadow, was a little girl. She was maybe 7 or 8, with dark braids that had come mostly loose from their ties, and she was watching Abigail with enormous, solemn eyes from underneath a sun-bleached bonnet. She didn't smile. She didn't say anything. She just held on to the back of her father's belt with 2 small hands and watched. Something moved in Abigail's chest that she hadn't felt in months. She pushed it down. "Can I help you?" she said. The man cleared his throat. "Ma'am, my name is Nathaniel Blackwood. I was told in town that you might be in need of a rancher." He paused. "I was told it by more than one person." Abigail looked at him steadily. "Is that right?" "Yes, ma'am." He didn't flinch from her tone. "I'm not from Harlan County. I came down from up near Billings. I've got 12 years working cattle, beef, and dairy both, and I know fence work, well maintenance, hay, and general repairs. I'm not asking for wages, at least not to start. I'm asking for work and a place to sleep for my daughter and me." He glanced briefly back at the girl. "Her name's Evangeline. We call her Evie." Abigail's eyes moved to the child again against her better judgment. Evie stared back at her unblinking with those big, serious eyes. "How old is she?" Abigail asked before she could stop herself. 8 years, 7 months. Abigail looked back at the man, Nathaniel Blackwood, from up near Billings, 12 years working cattle. He was telling the truth about the work she could see, that in the shape of his hands. A man who claimed ranching experience, but had soft hands, was lying. His were not soft. "Where's her mother?" Abigail asked. Something moved across his face. It was quick, the kind of thing a person got good at hiding, but she caught it. "Gone," he said. "About 1.5 years now. Fever took her." The word landed between them quietly. Abigail understood the word gone the way you only understood it after you'd used it yourself about someone you couldn't stand to name out loud. She stepped back from the door, not quite far enough to be an invitation, but enough to indicate she hadn't made up her mind to send him away. "Who told you to come here?" she asked. "Man at the feed store," Nathaniel said. "Didn't give his name. Just said there was a widow out on the Thornfield spread who was running it alone and might need help before the summer finished her off." He paused. "His words, ma'am, not mine." Before the summer finished her off. She'd bet anything it was Earl Delman, who ran the dry goods and who had the subtlety of a boot heel. She almost felt grateful to him. Almost. "You got references?" she asked. "I got a letter from a rancher up in Yellowstone County named Holt Brennan. I worked his spread for 4 years. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a folded piece of paper and held it out to her. She took it, read it. The handwriting was plain, and the praise was practical. Blackwood's a hard worker, good with cattle and horses, reliable. The kind of reference that didn't bother with flattery, and therefore meant more than one that did. She handed it back. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "I want to be direct with you because I don't have time to be anything else. This ranch is behind on its note. I've got 60 days before the bank starts making my life very unpleasant. I've got a south fence that's coming apart, a well that's giving me trouble, 43 head of cattle in the north pasture that need moving before the grass burns out, and more to do than one person can do before October." She kept her voice even. "I can offer you the bunkhouse outback meals and a small wage once we're stable, if we get stable. I can't promise anything beyond that." "I'm not asking for promises," Nathaniel said. "I'm asking for work." She held his gaze for a long moment. "There's a cot in the bunkhouse," she said. "It's not much, but it's out of the sun. Your daughter can have the small room off the kitchen. It was a pantry once. It's clean." She paused. "I don't need you here for company, Mr. Blackwood. I need you here because that fence is going to let my cattle into the Morrison grazing land if it goes down, and that will create a problem I can't afford." "Understood," he said. "You start tomorrow, first light." He put his hat back on his head and nodded. "First light, ma'am. Thank you." She was already turning back into the house when she heard a small voice from behind him. "Ma'am?" Abigail stopped. She turned. Evie had come out from behind her father's leg. She was standing straight now, her chin lifted, her bonnet tilted slightly to the left. She was holding a slightly battered cloth rabbit against her side. "Do you have chickens?" Evie asked. Despite everything, the bank letter under the flour tin, the rotting fence post, the 60 days, Abigail felt something happen to the left side of her mouth that she hadn't felt in a long time. "I've got 7, she said. Evie nodded seriously. "I'm good with chickens," she said. "I won't bother them." "That's good to know," Abigail said. She closed the door. She stood still in the kitchen for a moment, listening to the sound of boots on the porch steps as they walked around toward the bunkhouse. Then she picked up her gloves and went to find her fence-fixing tools. The next morning, Nathaniel Blackwood was standing in the yard before the sun had cleared the hill. Abigail had expected to have to wake him. She'd told herself she would, and she'd prepared the exact tone of voice, patient but firm, she'd use when she knocked on the bunkhouse door. Instead, she came out of the kitchen at 4:45, and he was already there, a shovel in one hand and her battered post-hole digger in the other, squinting at the south fence line from across the yard. "I counted 6 posts that need replacing before the line gets worse," he said without turning around. "I can have the worst 3 done before noon if you can spare the lumber." Abigail stopped in the doorway. "There's lumber stacked along the north side of the barn," she said. "Some of it's decent." "I saw it," he said. "I'll sort through it." She came down the porch steps. "You been awake long?" "Long enough." She paused. "Did Evie sleep all right?" Something in his posture shifted, not much, but enough. "She did," he said. "First time in a while she's slept in a room of her own. She's used to us boarding." He hesitated. "She thanked you this morning, before you came out. She told the rabbit to thank you too." Abigail looked out at the fence line. "Tell her the chickens are in the pen behind the house," she said. "She can check for eggs after breakfast if she wants." "She'll want," Nathaniel said, and she could hear something in his voice that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. They worked from sunup until the light started going orange and long in the afternoon. Nathaniel worked hard and quiet the way she liked. He didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't offer unsolicited opinions, and didn't treat her like she needed explaining things to. When he came across something that needed a decision, the angle of a gate, whether a post was salvageable or needed pulling, he asked her. Once listened to the answer and did it. By noon, 3 posts were in. By mid-afternoon, 4. Evie appeared at the fence line around 10 in the morning, clutching 3 brown eggs in the front fold of her dress and holding them like they were small treasures. "I found 3, she announced. "The speckled one tried to bite me, but I was faster." "Her name's Gertrude," Abigail said, without looking up from the wire she was stretching. "She does that." "I figured out if you talk to her first, she's less mean about it," Evie said. Nathaniel glanced at his daughter. "You talked to the chicken." "I talked at her," Evie corrected with the particular dignity of a child who knew the difference. She didn't really talk back, but she stopped biting. Abigail stood up, pressed one hand against the small of her back, and looked at the girl. "You can put those in the kitchen," she said. "On the table." "I know where the kitchen is," Evie said calmly, and turned and walked back toward the house. Nathaniel watched her go. "She's a serious child," Abigail observed. "She is," he said. "She's been serious since she was about 3. Her mother said it was because she came out listening." He paused, wrapping wire around the new post with practiced turns of his wrist. "She's good, though. She doesn't ask for much." Abigail said nothing. She reached for the next section of wire. "Neither do I." Nathaniel said, Not like he was asking her to notice it, just like he was making sure she knew. I meant what I said on the porch. I'm not here to take anything from you, Mrs. Thornfield. I know how this looks, man. Shows up, needs work, talks his way onto a widow's property. I know what folks might say. I don't much care what folks say, Abigail said. He glanced at her. I'm starting to believe that, he said. The trouble started on the 5th day. Abigail was in the barn when she heard the hoofbeats, 2 horses coming in fast off the main road, not slowing down. The way people slowed down when they were coming to visit. Coming in the way people came in when they wanted you to know they were coming. She walked out of the barn and stood in the yard and watched them come. The man in front was Pike Morrison. She knew him. Everybody in Harlan County knew Pike Morrison, the way you knew a bad tooth unavoidably, and with a particular quality of dread. He was broad through the chest and narrow through the eyes, and he worked for Cyrus Hartwell, which meant whatever he was here to say came from Hartwell's direction and Hartwell's intentions. The man behind him she didn't recognize. Young with a rifle propped casual across his saddle in a way that was meant to be noticed. Morrison pulled up short of the porch and didn't dismount, which was a deliberate discourtesy. Mrs. Thornfield, he said. Mr. Morrison, she said. I didn't expect you. No, I don't suppose you did. He looked around the yard slowly, the way a man looked at something he was already calculating a price for. His eyes found Nathaniel, who had come out of the south side of the barn and was standing still watching. Morrison looked at him for a moment, then back at Abigail. Mr. Hartwell sent me out to make an inquiry. About what? About this property. He said it plain, like it was already decided. Mr. Hartwell has an interest in acquiring it given your current situation. He's prepared to offer you a fair price. More than fair considering the state of the place. Abigail clasped her hands in front of her. The place is not for sale. Morrison smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. Mrs. Thornfield, now be reasonable. You're a woman alone out here. I'm not alone, Abigail said. Morrison glanced at Nathaniel again. A hired hand doesn't change the situation, he said. You're behind on the note. The bank's not going to wait forever. Mr. Hartwell, he's a patient man, but he's got plans for this valley, and this property sits right in the middle of them. It'd be better for everyone if you took the offer while it's generous. And if I don't? Abigail said. Morrison tilted his head. Well, he said slowly, things have a way of getting harder, don't they? For folks trying to hold on to more than they can manage. He paused, let the words settle. Especially in a summer like this one. Dry as a bone. You know how fast things catch fire when the grass goes dry. The yard went silent, except for the sound of the horses shifting their weight. Nathaniel took 3 steps forward, and his voice when he spoke was quiet and level, and contained something in it that made Morrison's horse toss its head. I reckon, Nathaniel said, that sounds an awful lot like a threat. Morrison looked at him with flat eyes. I reckon it sounds like friendly advice. Friendly advice comes from people who knock on the front door, Nathaniel said. It doesn't come from men who ride in without being invited and talk to a woman about what she can and can't manage. He stopped walking. He was close enough now to look up at Morrison directly. Mrs. Thornfield gave you her answer. You should ride on. The young man behind Morrison moved his rifle slightly. Nathaniel didn't look at him. Morrison looked at Nathaniel for a long moment. Then he looked at Abigail. You've made a choice, Mrs. Thornfield, he said. I hope it's the right one. He turned his horse and rode out, the young man following. Abigail didn't move until the sound of the hoofbeats faded. Then she turned and looked at Nathaniel, who was standing with his hands at his sides and his jaw set and his eyes still on the road. You shouldn't have done that, she said. He turned to look at her. No, ma'am, he said, but I did. She stood very still. She wanted to be angry. She'd handled her own land, her own problems, her own trouble since before the ground closed over Thomas. She didn't need a man stepping in front of her and speaking for her. But she also knew what Cyrus Hartwell was. She knew what he wanted. She knew that the threat about fire had not been metaphorical. And she knew, standing in the yard in the brutal July heat, that she had exactly one ally left between herself and 60 days running out. He was standing in front of her with dirty hands and a quiet face, and he had just squared himself against one of the most powerful men in the county without being asked. "Those men will go back to Hartwell," she said, "and they'll tell him what you said." "I know," Nathaniel said. "That makes things harder," she said. "It does," he said. "You realize that?" "I do." She looked at him. "Why did you step in?" He was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his voice was even. "Because he was talking about fire," he said, "and my daughter is sleeping in that house." Abigail held his gaze. Then she nodded once, small tight, and walked back toward the barn. But her hands, she noticed, were shaking slightly. And it wasn't from anger. It was from something she hadn't felt in a long time, the strange, unwelcome, desperate relief of knowing that someone was standing beside her. She didn't know what to do with that yet. So she picked up her hammer and went back to work. Abigail didn't sleep that night. She lay on top of the quilt with her boots still on and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around her in the heat. The clock on the mantel ticked. The well chain tapped against the stone outside when the wind moved. Somewhere out past the north pasture, a coyote called once, and then went quiet. She kept hearing Morrison's voice. "You know how fast things catch fire when the grass goes dry? Not a warning, a schedule." She got up at 3 in the morning, lit a candle, and sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil and wrote down everything she knew about Cyrus Hartwell. It didn't take long. What she knew was mostly rumor, and rumor in Harlan County tended to start from the same place it ended at Hartwell's own table. He was from back east originally. He'd come to Montana 7 years ago with money nobody could explain, and had started buying land the way some men bought drink steadily, without apparent limit, and with a quality of pleasure that had nothing to do with need. He owned the mill, the largest grazing tract in the county, and 3 of the 5 men who sat on the town council. He did not own the bank, but he was friendly with the man who did. 60 days. She underlined the number. She heard the bunkhouse door open and close. She didn't move for a moment. Then she heard boots on the back porch, quiet, not trying to wake anyone, and she got up and opened the kitchen door. Nathaniel was sitting on the top porch step in the dark with his arms on his knees and a tin cup in his hands, looking out at nothing in particular. He turned when the door opened. He didn't look surprised to see her. "Couldn't sleep either," he said. It wasn't a question. "No." She stepped out and leaned against the porch post. "You should get rest. We've got the east fence tomorrow, and the hay in the second field needs turning before it molds." "I know," he said. "I'll be fine." She was quiet for a moment. "Nathaniel." He looked up at her. "What do you know about Hartwell?" she asked. "Before today. You hear anything in town when you came through?" He was quiet for a beat too long. "What?" she said. He set down the cup. "When I was at the feed store, the man who told me to come out here, he didn't just say you needed help." He paused. "He said Hartwell had been trying to buy this land for 2 years and that you and your husband wouldn't sell. He said after Thomas passed, Hartwell gave it 3 months before he moved." Abigail's jaw tightened. "And you didn't think to mention that when you knocked on my door?" "I thought if I led with it, you'd send me away before I got to the part about the work," he said. He looked at her steadily. "I wasn't wrong." She wanted to argue. She couldn't. "No," she said. "You weren't." "I should have told you sooner," he said. "I'm telling you now." She crossed her arms, not angry exactly, but not settled either. "So he's been planning this." "Looks that way." Nathaniel picked the cup back up, turned it slowly. "Morrison coming out here the way he did, that wasn't a courtesy call. That was Hartwell deciding the time was right. He's watching the bank deadline, same as you are. If I can't make the payment, Abigail said, the bank forecloses. Hartwell moves in. He probably already has a number agreed with the bank, Nathaniel said. He wouldn't send Morrison out here to threaten you unless the ground was already laid. She stood still with that for a moment. Outside, a breeze moved through the yard and died. He's not getting this land, she said. No, ma'am, Nathaniel said. He's not. The certainty in his voice was quiet and complete, and it landed somewhere in her chest and stayed there. She went back inside. She did not sleep, but she stopped being afraid, which was different, and in its own way, more useful. By the end of the first week, Harlan County had an opinion about Nathaniel Blackwood. Abigail heard it on Thursday when she drove into Grover's Bend for wire and salt. She heard it before she was even down from the wagon. Two women outside the milliner's shop who stopped talking when they saw her, but not quite fast enough. A man staying out there, with a child. She hardly knows him. 4 days. Well, Thomas hasn't been gone 6 months. She walked into Delman's dry goods and put her list on the counter and looked at Earl Delman with a face so flat and steady that he didn't say a word about anything except the price of wire, which had gone up 2 cents a yard. She loaded the wagon herself because she always loaded it herself and drove home. She told Nathaniel that evening while they were eating supper, Evie between them at the table working through a bowl of beans with the focused seriousness she applied to most things. They're talking, Abigail said. Nathaniel didn't look up from his plate. They were going to talk, he said. It might get worse, she said. It might. He broke off a piece of cornbread. Does it change anything? No, she said after a moment. I just thought you should know. Evie looked up from her beans. Who's talking? People in town, Abigail said. Evie considered this. What are they saying? Nothing that matters, Nathaniel said in the tone that meant the subject was finished. Evie looked at Abigail. Then she looked back at her beans. Papa says people talk when they don't have enough to do, she said. He says useful people are mostly too tired to gossip. Abigail looked at Nathaniel. He kept his eyes on his plate, but the corner of his mouth moved. Smart man, Abigail said. I have my moments, he said. Done. The twist came on a Sunday, 9 days after Nathaniel arrived, and it didn't come from Hartwell. It came from Thomas. Abigail was going through the desk in Thomas's study, looking for the deed, which she needed to verify the property lines before the bank could dispute them, when she found the letter. It was in the back of the bottom drawer, folded twice with her name on the outside in Thomas's handwriting. She knew by the weight of it before she'd even opened it that it wasn't recent. The paper had yellowed slightly at the fold. She sat down in Thomas's chair and read it. It took her a long time. When she was done, she folded it back exactly the way it had been and sat very still for a while with her hands flat on the desk. Thomas had written the letter 8 months before he died during a stretch in the autumn when the cattle prices fell and the note payment had come due. He'd written it because he'd been afraid. Afraid he wouldn't be able to tell her in person. Afraid he'd run out of time. Afraid she'd find out some other way. The letter said 3 things. First, that he loved her in the plain and practical way Thomas had always said things he meant. Second, that the note on the ranch was larger than he'd told her, considerably larger, because he'd borrowed against the property a second time that autumn to cover the shortfall from a private lender rather than the bank. The third thing was the name of the lender, Cyrus Hartwell. Abigail sat in the chair for a long time. The clock in the kitchen ticked. Evie's voice floated in from outside. She was talking to the chickens again, a running commentary that Abigail had started to notice the way you noticed birdsong, present and constant and somehow comforting. She got up. She walked out to the yard. Nathaniel was at the well drawing water up for the cattle trough. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and whatever was on her face made him set down the bucket. What happened? He said. She held out the letter. He read it. She watched his face as he did the way it went still, then careful, then tight around the jaw. He read it twice. Then he folded it and handed it back to her. He already owns part of the debt, Nathaniel said. He owns the private note, Abigail said. The bank holds the original mortgage. If I can make the bank payment, Hartwell can't foreclose through them. But the private note—" She stopped. Her voice had gone flat and controlled the way it went when she was working hard to keep it that way. "If he calls in the private note, I can't cover it. Not without selling cattle, and if I sell cattle, I don't have enough stock to make the ranch pay." Nathaniel said nothing for a moment. "He's been holding this since Thomas borrowed it," she said. "He's been sitting on it. Waiting. Waiting for Thomas to die," Nathaniel said quietly. The words were brutal. They were also accurate. "He set the trap before Thomas was even sick," Abigail said. "He loaned the money knowing Thomas was struggling, knowing the terms were tight. He knew Thomas wouldn't tell me the full amount. He knew—" She stopped again. She pressed her lips together. He knew that eventually he'd get to call it in. Nathaniel looked at her. "How much is the private note?" she told him. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. They both knew what the number meant. "There's a land attorney," Nathaniel said after a moment. "Up in Helena. Man named Carver. I heard his name mentioned once. He goes up against lenders who set predatory terms, tries to get the notes renegotiated or challenged. I don't know if he'd take a case like this, but it might be worth writing to him." "I don't have money for an attorney," Abigail said. "You might not need money up front," Nathaniel said. "Some of them work on contingency when they think they can win." He paused. "You'd need to show him the original lending agreement, that Thomas signed under duress, or that the terms weren't disclosed properly." "I don't have the original lending agreement," she said. Nathaniel was quiet. "It wasn't in the desk," she said. "Thomas must have kept it somewhere else, or Hartwell—" She stopped. "Or Hartwell has it." "Then we need to find out what terms were agreed," Nathaniel said, "before Hartwell decides to move." She looked at him. "And how do we do that?" "You have neighbors," he said. "Ranchers who've dealt with Hartwell before. People who've seen how he operates. Someone in this county knows how his private lending works because you're probably not the first family he's done this to." Abigail thought about that. She thought about the Hendersons 3 miles north, who'd sold their place 2 years ago, under circumstances that nobody in town talked about directly, but everyone understood. She thought about the Greer widow over east, who'd taken a job in town and left her land sitting empty rather than sell, and nobody had explained why. "I know who to ask," she said. "Joe," she wrote out the next morning before Nathaniel was done with the cattle, telling him only that she had an errand and would be back by midday. The Henderson place was 3 miles north and technically belonged to a man from Billings now, but Ruth Henderson still lived with her daughter-in-law in the farmhouse at the edge of the property in an arrangement nobody had adequately explained and nobody had questioned, because Ruth Henderson at 71 had a quality about her that discouraged unnecessary questions. Ruth answered the door before Abigail had knocked twice, which meant she'd been watching from the window, which meant she'd expected company. "Abigail Thornfield," Ruth said. "Come in out of the heat." She came in. Ruth poured coffee, real coffee, not the chicory blend most people were using in the summer shortage, and sat across from her at the kitchen table and folded her hands and waited. "Ruth," Abigail said, "I need to know about Hartwell." Ruth's expression didn't change. "Do you?" "He holds a private note on my land. Thomas borrowed from him before he died. I found out last night." She kept her voice level. "I need to know if he did the same to you." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What makes you think I'll tell you?" "Because he's going to take my land in 60 days, if I can't find a way to stop him," Abigail said. "And because I think you know exactly how he does it." Ruth looked at her for a long time. Something in the old woman's face moved, not softened exactly, but shifted like a door opening just a crack. "He did the same to us," Ruth said. "Lent Caleb the money in the bad season. Terms were in the agreement, but the agreement was written in language Caleb didn't understand fully, and Hartwell knew that when he wrote it. When the time came, he had 3 lawyers, and we had nothing." She paused. "He gave us a choice. Sell, or he files to collect on the note, and takes us to court, where it'll cost more than the land is worth to fight him." She set down her coffee cup. "We sold." "The lending agreement," Abigail said. "Did you keep a copy?" Ruth looked at her steadily. Then she stood up without a word and left the room. Abigail heard her moving in the back of the house, a drawer opening, something heavy shifting. Ruth came back with a folded document creased and slightly water-stained at one corner, and set it on the table between them. "I kept it," Ruth said, "because I knew someday someone would need it." Abigail looked down at the document. Then she looked up at Ruth. "I'm going to take this to an attorney in Helena," she said. "If the terms were predatory, if he's been doing this systematically." "He has," Ruth said flatly. "The Greers, the Mallory family over on the South Fork. At least 2 others I know of who left quietly because they were ashamed." She sat back down. "He picks the ones who can't fight back, the ones who don't have lawyers or money or men with loud voices." Her eyes were sharp and clear. "He picked you because Thomas died and he figured you'd fold." "He figured wrong," Abigail said. Ruth looked at her for a moment. "You've got that man out at your place," she said. "Blackwood." Abigail met her eyes. "He works the ranch." "I heard what he said to Morrison," Ruth said. "Word got around." She picked up her coffee cup again. "Hartwell heard it too. Don't think he didn't." The air between them was heavy and still. "Then I need to move faster than he does," Abigail said. "Yes," Ruth said simply. "You do." She rode back to the ranch with Ruth Henderson's document folded inside her coat, and her mind moving faster than her horse. Nathaniel was at the barn when she came in, and she told him everything. Ruth, the pattern, the other families, the document. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done, he stood still for a moment with his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance thinking. "He's not just a land grabber," Nathaniel said. "He's been running a system." "Yes," Abigail said. "Then we need more than one attorney," he said. "We need the families, all of them who'll speak." She looked at him. "They're ashamed," she said. "Ruth said it herself. Some of them won't want to come forward." "Maybe not," Nathaniel said. "But shame's got a way of burning off when someone else is willing to stand first." He looked at her. "Are you willing?" She didn't hesitate. "I'm willing." Something moved in his expression, brief quiet, like sunlight moving across a wall. "Then write to the attorney in Helena," he said. "Tonight. I'll ride it into town first thing tomorrow and get it on the stage." She nodded. Then she stopped. "Nathaniel." He looked at her. "Why are you still here?" she asked. Not unkindly, directly. "Morrison's already seen your face. Hartwell knows you spoke up. You've made yourself a target on someone else's land. You could take Evie and go north, find work somewhere Hartwell's name doesn't reach." She held his gaze. "Why are you staying?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the barn door. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at her. "Because walking away from a fight when the cause is right is something I did once before," he said. "And I've been paying for it since." He paused. "I'm not doing it again." She didn't ask what he meant. Not yet. The weight of it, whatever it carried, whatever he'd walked away from before, and regretted, was something she understood without the details. She nodded once, turned toward the house. "Abigail," he said. She stopped. "Lock the doors tonight," he said. "Both of them." She stood with her back to him for one moment, feeling the full weight of what he wasn't saying, that Morrison's visit had been a warning, and warnings in Hartwell's world only came once. "I always do," she said, and went inside. Behind her, she heard him pick up the hammer and go back to work. And somewhere around the side of the house, Evie's voice drifted out from the chicken pen, steady and calm, explaining something to Gertrude that Gertrude probably didn't understand and certainly didn't deserve. The ranch was quiet. The summer pressed down. The clock was running. And for the first time in 4 months, Abigail Thornfield was not running from it. She was running toward something. The letter to Attorney Carver in Helena went out on the Tuesday morning stage, and for 3 days after that, Abigail waited. She didn't wait idly. There was no such thing as idle on the Thornfield Ranch in the middle of a Montana summer. The hay in the second field got turned and baled. The cattle got moved to the north pasture where the grass was still holding. The east fence got 2 new posts and a full stretch of fresh wire. Nathaniel worked from before sunrise until the light gave out completely, and he did it without complaint and without the kind of constant talking that some men use to fill silence they were uncomfortable with. He was comfortable with silence. That more than anything was what made the days bearable. Evie had taken over the chickens completely. Not in a way that anyone had asked her to. She'd simply assumed the responsibility with the quiet certainty of a child who had decided something was hers to care for. And now Gertrude came when she was called, which Abigail would not have believed if she hadn't seen it herself. She bribed her, Nathaniel said at supper on Wednesday when Abigail mentioned it. Evie looked up from her plate with perfect composure. "I gave her extra scratch," she said. "That's not bribing, that's relationship building." Nathaniel looked at Abigail. Abigail pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. "Where did you learn that phrase?" Nathaniel asked his daughter. "A man in Billings said it," Evie said. "He was selling horses. You told him he was bribing the buyers, and he said he was relationship building, and you said that was the same thing, and he said no, it wasn't, and then you didn't buy the horse." "I didn't buy the horse because the horse had a bad knee," Nathaniel said. "And because you didn't trust the man?" Evie said. Nathaniel picked up his fork. "Eat your supper." Evie ate her supper, but she met Abigail's eyes across the table with a look of such serene, patient accuracy that Abigail had to look away before she actually laughed out loud. And laughing out loud was something she hadn't done in 4 months, and she wasn't ready for it yet. It felt like something that needed more time, like a bone that had been broken and was still knitting. But she was close. She could feel it. That was what made Thursday so hard. Abigail was at the well. Thursday morning when she heard the wagon coming up the road. Not a rider this time, a wagon moving slow, which meant either a delivery or a conversation somebody had decided needed witnesses. It was Reverend Aldous Marsh from First Baptist, which was worse than either. He climbed down from the wagon with the careful dignity of a man who had spent decades cultivating the impression that he was above physical inconvenience. He was in his Sunday coat despite the heat. He was carrying his hat in one hand and a Bible in the other, which Abigail recognized as a staging choice. The Bible meant the visit was pastoral in nature, which meant he was going to say something she wouldn't like and wanted the Lord's authority behind it. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said with the warm, sorrowful tone he used for funerals and difficult conversations. "I'm glad I caught you." "Reverend," she said. She didn't offer her hand. "What can I do for you?" He looked past her toward the barn, where Nathaniel was visible working on the latch of the main door. He looked for a beat too long. "I've been concerned," he said, bringing his eyes back to her. "As your pastor." "You're not my pastor," Abigail said pleasantly. "Thomas attended First Baptist. I came with him out of courtesy." Marsh absorbed this without visible disruption. "As a concerned member of this community, then, I've heard talk, Abigail, troubling talk, about a man living on your property, eating at your table, a man nobody knows with a child." "A rancher," Abigail said, "doing the work I need done." "An unmarried man," Marsh said, and the word unmarried had a particular weight in his mouth, like it explained everything wrong with the situation. "He's a widower," Abigail said. "As I am a widow. Neither of us is in a position that requires your supervision, Reverend." "The town is watching," Marsh said. His voice dropped to something that was meant to sound like compassion, but landed closer to warning. "Your reputation. Abigail Thomas's reputation. Thomas is dead. Abigail said. Her voice was quiet and absolutely final. His reputation died with him, because that's how death works. What's alive right now is his land and his debt, and his wife and I am handling all three of them as best I can, and I am doing it without the assistance of anyone who shows up on a Thursday morning to tell me what the town thinks of my choices. She took one step closer to him. Is there anything else I can do for you? Marsh looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was tight. You should be careful, he said. Hartwell is a generous donor to this community. A man with his resources can make life very comfortable for people who cooperate and very difficult for those who don't. The silence that followed that sentence was extraordinary. Abigail heard Nathaniel stop working. The latch clinking went quiet. She did not look toward the barn. Get back in your wagon, Reverend, she said. He got back in his wagon. She watched him drive away, and then she turned, and Nathaniel was standing 10 feet behind her, completely still, with the latch hardware still in his hand. He works for Hartwell, Nathaniel said. He works for the collection plate, Abigail said. Which Hartwell fills. She turned back toward the house. Come in, there's coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, and she told him what she was thinking, that Marsh's visit meant Hartwell was feeling the pressure of her silence. She hadn't sold, hadn't folded, hadn't sent Nathaniel away. 3 weeks in, and the ranch was running better than it had in months. Hartwell had sent Morrison, and that hadn't worked. Now he was sending the preacher. When the preacher doesn't work, Nathaniel said, what comes next? Something that doesn't come to the front door, Abigail said. They looked at each other. I want you to start sleeping in the house, she said. The bunkhouse is too far from the barn. If someone comes at night to do what Morrison implied. She stopped. Evie should be inside the main house anyway. Nathaniel nodded slowly. I'll move our things tonight. There's a room off the back, she said. It was Thomas's study. It's not large. It's fine, he said. She stood up and picked up her coffee cup and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the yard. He's going to come at us harder, she said. Before the attorney and Helena can answer. He's going to try to force a decision before we can build a case. Then we need to talk to the other families before he does, Nathaniel said. The ones Ruth mentioned, the Greers, the Mallory family. I'll ride out to the Greers tomorrow, Abigail said. Clara Greer won't turn me away. I'll go with you, Nathaniel said. She shook her head. You need to be here, if someone comes while we're both gone. I'm not letting you ride to a neighboring ranch alone when Hartwell is running out of patience, he said. He said it flat, not asking, not arguing, just stating it the way you stated facts. She turned and looked at him. Mr. Blackwood. Nathaniel, he said. She stopped. It was the first time he'd corrected her on his name, and they both knew what it meant. The formality between them had been doing a particular kind of work, keeping a safe, manageable distance between two people who had no business feeling anything other than professional toward each other, for reasons that were long and complicated, and had to do with grief and time and the specific loneliness of surviving someone. Nathaniel, she said, and his name in her mouth felt unfamiliar and exactly right at the same time, which was not something she was prepared to examine. We'll take Evie with us, he said. She can wait with the horses. She'll talk to the horses, Abigail said. They won't mind, he said. Clara Greer was a small, dry-eyed woman in her late 50s who had the look of someone who had spent a long time being afraid and had recently decided she was done with it. She opened the door before they knocked, same as Ruth Henderson, which told Abigail that word about her situation had been traveling on the wind, the way news traveled in ranch country sideways and fast, and through no one in particular. I heard about Morrison's visit, Clara said, stepping back to let them in. Come in. She poured no coffee. She sat straight in her chair and looked at Nathaniel, once a brief measuring look, and then at Abigail. How many families do you know of for certain? Abigail asked. 6, Clara said. 4 sold, 2 left without selling because they couldn't stand to. She set her hands on the table. Hartwell's notes all had the same term buried in them, a demand clause. Means he can call the full note due at any time with 30 days notice, regardless of whether payments are current. No bank does that. But Hartwell writes his own contracts, and men who are desperate in a bad season don't read every line the way they should. Thomas didn't read every line, Abigail said quietly. No, Clara said. He wasn't the first. Nathaniel leaned forward. Mrs. Greer, would you testify to that? To an attorney in Helena who's looking at the pattern of Hartwell's lending. Clara was quiet for a long moment. My son is in Grover's Bend, she said. He works at the mill, Hartwell's mill. I know, Nathaniel said. I'm asking if you'd testify anyway. The air in the room was very still. If Ruth Henderson stands, Clara said finally, and the Mallorys, I won't be the only one. You won't be, Abigail said. I'm going to the Mallorys next. Clara looked at her with something in her face that was almost recognition, the particular look of a woman who has watched another woman decide to stop being afraid and remembers the feeling. Then yes, Clara said. I'll testify. They were 3 miles from home, the sun going low and orange, and the horses moving at a steady trot, Evie dozing against Nathaniel's shoulder in the wagon seat when Abigail smelled it. Smoke. Not cook-fire smoke. Not the dry, clean smell of wood burning in a hearth. Something wider. Something that moved in the air with the particular urgency of something that had grown past where it was supposed to be. Nathaniel smelled it at the same moment. She knew because he went rigid beside her. They looked at each other. Evie. His voice was very quiet. Wake up, sweetheart. She looked up. She smelled it too. She didn't make a sound. Nathaniel snapped the reins. The barn was on fire. They saw the glow half a mile out, orange and savage against the darkening sky, and Abigail was down from the wagon before it fully stopped running across the yard, shouting for the cattle that were luckily in the north pasture, and not in any stall. Nathaniel had the water buckets. He'd dropped Evie at the house door with one word inside, and she'd gone without argument, which told Abigail that Evie Blackwood had seen enough of the hard world to know when it was time to stay out of the way. The fire had started in the far corner of the barn in the hay storage section, exactly where it would do the most damage to the feed supply. It had not started by accident. There was no lantern left in that corner. There was no reason for a flame to start there. Abigail knew it. Nathaniel knew it. They fought it anyway. Neighbors came within 20 minutes. The Hendersons first, then the Bauer family from 2 miles east. Then 3 men from town who'd seen the glow from the road and come without being asked. They worked the bucket line from the well until the muscle in Abigail's arm stopped hurting and went numb, and the fire came down, and the east wall of the barn held, and the loft held, and by some grace that Abigail could not fully account for, the main structure stood. The hay was gone. The feed stored in the left corner was ash. The tools kept along the south wall. Thomas's tools, some of them older than their marriage, were warped and blackened. When it was over, when the last ember was out, and the men were standing in the yard with their buckets and their blackened hands, Abigail stood in front of what was left of the barn and didn't move for a long time. She heard Nathaniel's boots behind her. Abigail, he said. Don't, she said. I'm not going to say it was an accident, he said. It wasn't. I know it wasn't. Her voice was level. Her hands were shaking again, and she was done pretending they weren't. He couldn't get me to sell, and he couldn't scare me off, so now he's burning what I have. Yes, Nathaniel said. She turned. The neighbors were still in the yard looking at her, the Bowers, the Henderson men, the 3 men from town. 12 people soot-faced and quiet waiting. She looked at them. These people had come running in the dark without being called. They'd worked beside her with their own hands and their own buckets, and nobody had asked them to. Something broke open in her chest. Not the breaking that meant falling apart. The other kind. The kind that made room. "Thank you," she said, and her voice cracked on the second word, and she didn't apologize for it. "All of you. Thank you." Old Bauer took off his hat. The Henderson boy nodded. "We'll come back tomorrow," Bauer said. "Help you clear out the damage, see what can be salvaged." "I'll bring my boys," said the man from town she didn't know by name. She nodded. She couldn't say any more than that right then. The neighbors filtered out, and when they were gone, Nathaniel went to check on Evie, and Abigail stood alone in her yard, and looked at her damaged barn, and looked at what was left of Thomas's tools, and felt the full fury of it rise in her, like something that had been waiting. She had been patient. She had been careful. She had worked inside the law, and written letters, and talked to neighbors, and done everything the right way. Hartwell had sent his man to burn her barn. When Nathaniel came back out, Evie asleep again inside, she was still standing there. "She's fine," he said before she could ask. "She had a cup of water and told me to tell you that Gertrude was upset about the smoke and she'd already talked to her." He paused. "The chickens are fine." A sound came out of Abigail that was half grief and half something that could, in different circumstances, have been a laugh. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes." "I need to know what you walked away from," she said. "In Billings. What you said you were paying for." He went very still. The yard was quiet. The barn smelled of wet ash and scorched wood. "My wife was sick for 8 months before she died," he said slowly. "I had a job offer in Wyoming, a foreman position, good wages. I took it. I thought I'd earn enough fast to pay for better doctors, better medicine." He stopped. "I wasn't there when she died. I was in Wyoming, and Evie was with a neighbor, and Margaret died in a boarding house with nobody in the room." He looked out at the dark. "I came back and got Evie, and I've been moving since then, trying to find work, trying to—" He stopped again. "Trying to be in the right place, so it doesn't happen again." Abigail looked at him for a long time. "And this is the right place," she said. He turned and looked at her directly, and the firelight from the last embers in the barn caught the edge of his face, and he looked tired and certain, and absolutely clear-eyed. "Yes," he said. "It is." She held his gaze. Then she looked back at the barn. "Then help me figure out how we hit back," she said. "Write to the attorney again," he said immediately. "Tell him about the fire. Tell him it happened 3 weeks after Morrison's visit, and tell him the timing. A judge won't ignore arson." "Hartwell will deny it," she said. "He'll deny it," Nathaniel agreed. "But Ruth Henderson has that document, and Clara Greer will testify, and now we have a burned barn with no natural cause." He looked at her. "He made a mistake tonight. He got impatient." Abigail looked at him. "Impatient men make more mistakes," she said. "They always do," he said. She pulled her coat around her against the cooler air coming down off the hills, and she looked at the barn one more time. The standing walls, the surviving structure, the shell of something that could be rebuilt. And she felt the grief of it settle into the place where she'd put all the other grief, and then she stepped past it. "In the morning," she said. "In the morning," he agreed. She went inside and locked both doors. Nathaniel stayed in the yard a while longer. She could see his silhouette through the kitchen window, standing watch in the dark, still steady facing the road. She didn't tell him to come in. She left the lamp burning in the window. And she sat down at the kitchen table and started writing the second letter to Helena, and this time her hand did not shake at all. The letter came from Helena on a Friday, 11 days after she'd sent the second one. Abigail was in the yard with Nathaniel when the boy from town rode up with it, young Danny Marsh, the Reverend's nephew, who had the decency to look uncomfortable delivering anything to the Thornfield Ranch, given what his uncle had said on that Thursday visit. He handed it over without a word and rode back fast. Abigail opened it, standing right there in the yard. Attorney Franklin Carver wrote in a tight, economical hand that got to the point faster than most men she'd dealt with. He had received both her letters. He had reviewed the case outline and the document she'd described from Ruth Henderson. He believed there was sufficient basis to investigate Hartwell's private lending practices for predatory contract terms and potential fraud. He would ride to Harlan County within the fortnight. He asked her to gather any willing witnesses and any documentation available. He would work on contingency if they won. He took a percentage of any judgment. If they lost, she owed him nothing but travel expenses. She read the last line twice. Then she handed the letter to Nathaniel without comment. He read it. When he looked up, his face was steady, but something in his eyes had shifted the particular quality of relief that a person showed when they'd been quietly bracing for disappointment and hadn't gotten it. 2 weeks, he said. Maybe less, she said. We need the Mallorys confirmed, and I want to talk to the Greer boy Clara's son at the mill. If Hartwell's running the same scheme through the mill workers as he runs through the ranchers, that's a bigger risk, Nathaniel said carefully. The boy could lose his job. He could, Abigail said. But if Hartwell's been lending money to mill workers at the same terms the demand clause, the buried language, then we're not just talking about 6 ranch families. We're talking about half the working people in Harlan County. She looked at him. That changes what a judge sees. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. You want to go talk to him? I want you to go talk to him, she said, man to man. I go in there, it's the widow from the Thornfield Ranch asking him to betray his employer. You go in, it's a working man asking another working man what he knows. She met his eyes. You're better at that than I am. He considered it. When? Tomorrow, she said. Before Hartwell hears about Carver's letter. Ted. Nathaniel rode into Grover's Bend the next morning alone, which was the first time since his arrival that Abigail had watched him ride out without her, and the specific quality of the quiet he left behind was something she was not prepared to analyze in the middle of a work morning. She kept busy. There was always enough to keep busy. The neighbors had come back the day after the fire, as Bauer had promised, and the cleanup had gone faster than she'd expected. Nathaniel and 4 other men working the debris, while the women organized what was salvageable and what wasn't. The tools along the south wall had mostly survived. The hay and feed were gone, which was the real wound, because replacing feed at summer prices with no cash reserve was the kind of problem that had no clean solution. But the Bauers had brought 2 bales of their own hay. The Henderson men had brought a third. The man from town, whose name she still didn't know, she'd learned it that morning. It was Walt Pruitt, and he ran the saddle repair shop, had shown up with a sack of grain and 2 lengths of good lumber, and had worked alongside them for 6 hours without asking anything in return. She thought about that now, moving through the morning chores. She'd lived in Harlan County for 16 years and spent most of them at a polite distance from its people, because Thomas had preferred it that way. Keep to your own. Abby neighbor trouble is the worst kind of trouble, and she had respected that. And for 16 years, the county had let her keep that distance without complaint. The fire had burned the distance down along with the hay. Evie found her in the middle of the morning, coming around the side of the house with her apron full of eggs and a look of restrained urgency on her face. Mrs. Thornfield, she said. Evie, Abigail said. Gertrude laid 5 eggs today, Evie said. She's never laid 5 before, usually 3, sometimes 4. That's a good day for Gertrude, Abigail said. I think it's because she's not scared anymore, Evie said. After the fire she was very upset, and she only laid 1, and I was worried about her. She paused. I told her the barn was going to be fixed, and that nobody was going to hurt her chickens. I think she believed me. Abigail looked at this child, 8 years old, 7 months, serious-faced and steady, carrying eggs in her apron and worrying about the emotional welfare of a chicken who had, by all accounts, spent 3 weeks trying to bite her. Evie, she said, how do you feel about all of this? The fire, the men coming, all of it. Evie thought about it with the genuine deliberateness she brought to most questions. Scared some, she said. But not the way I was scared when Mama died. That was a kind of scared where the thing you're afraid of already happened. This is the other kind, where it hasn't happened yet, and maybe it won't." She looked at Abigail clearly. "Papa says the second kind is the one you can do something about." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "Your papa is right," she said. Evie nodded, like that confirmed something she'd already decided, and went back to the house with her eggs. Nathaniel came back from town at midday, and Abigail knew before he was off the horse that something had happened. Not by his expression, he kept his face controlled when he was thinking, but by the pace of him, deliberate, like a man carrying something fragile and moving carefully. He came into the kitchen and sat down, and she put coffee in front of him without being asked. "James Greer," he said. "Clara's son." "What about him?" "He talked." Nathaniel wrapped his hands around the cup. "Took some doing. He was nervous, kept looking at the mill door the whole time we were talking, which tells you something about how Hartwell runs that place. But he talked." He looked up. "Hartwell's been lending to mill workers for 3 years. Same terms, same demand clause. 6 men that James knows of who've borrowed and are currently behind on their notes." He paused. "And 2 who borrowed, defaulted, and lost property, not ranch land, but houses and lots in town. One of them moved away. One of them is still here working for Hartwell to pay back a debt he signed under terms he didn't understand." Abigail sat down slowly. "He's running the same system inside the town itself." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "Hartwell doesn't just want ranch land. He wants to own the county, everything and everyone in it." He set down the cup. "James will talk to Carver. He said if enough people come forward he will, but he won't go first." "He doesn't have to go first," Abigail said. "We have Ruth. We have Clara. We have the Mallorys." She stopped. "Did you get to the Mallorys?" "Yes. Old Frank Mallory said yes before I finished asking. He's been waiting 2 years for someone to give him a way to fight back." Something moved in Nathaniel's voice. He cried Abigail, 63 years old, and he sat at his kitchen table and cried because someone was finally asking. The kitchen was very quiet. "How many do we have?" she said. 7 willing witnesses, counting Ruth," he said. "Plus James Greer if others go first. Plus whatever records Carver can compel Hartwell to produce." He looked at her steadily. "It's enough. If Carver is what his letter says he is, it's enough." She nodded. She should have felt the weight lift. It didn't quite. "There's still the bank deadline," she said. "Carver coming doesn't stop that clock." "No," Nathaniel said. "It doesn't." She looked at the flour tin under which Thomas's bank letter still sat. She'd stopped rereading it, but she knew the number as well as she knew her own name. "I need $1,200 before the deadline," she said. "I have $400 from the cattle I can sell without crippling the herd. I have Thomas's pocket watch, which is silver and worth maybe $60 to the right buyer, and I have $800 of distance between me and keeping this land." She said it flat. No dramatics, just the number. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "I have money," he said. She looked at him. "Debt. Not much," he said quickly. "But I've been saving since Billings. $340 in a bank in Yellowstone County. I can have it wired to Grover's Bend inside a week." "No," she said. "Abigail." "No," she said again. "That's your money. Yours and Evie's. It's what you have between you and nothing. I am not taking that." "You're not taking it," he said. "I'm offering it." "The answer is still no." "Then it's a loan," he said. "When Carver wins and Hartwell's assets are seized, you pay me back. With interest if it makes you feel better." She looked at him hard. He looked back at her with that same quality she'd noticed from the first day, the absolute level steadiness of a man who had decided something and meant it all the way down. "Why?" she said. "Because I told you this was the right place," he said quietly. "And I meant it. And this ranch needs to still be standing for that to matter." The silence between them was different from the silences they'd had before. It was heavier and more honest and more frightening, and Abigail felt it in a way she couldn't fully account for and wasn't going to try. 340, she said. Yes. That leaves us 460 short. Yes. He paused. But we've got a week before Carver comes, and 7 people who owe Hartwell a debt who might be willing to think creatively about how they repay it. He stood up. Let me ride out to Mallory again. He mentioned something about a note he'd been holding, a small lending arrangement with another rancher. If he can call that in early and contribute it toward your payment as a bridge. You're building a coalition, she said. I'm building what's necessary, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up and picked up her coffee cup and said, Go, but be back before dark. He nodded and picked up his hat. Nathaniel, she said. He stopped. Thank you, she said. Not for the money, for all of it. He understood that. Yes, ma'am, he said and went. The twist that Abigail hadn't seen coming arrived that same afternoon in the form of a woman she hadn't spoken to in 3 years. Her name was Dora Sinclair, and she was Cyrus Hartwell's private secretary, and she came to the Thornfield Ranch alone in a small buggy, wearing a gray dress and a look of someone who had been rehearsing something and was still not sure they were going to say it. Abigail came out of the barn and stopped when she saw who it was. Mrs. Thornfield, Dora said. She climbed down from the buggy carefully. She was a small woman, precise in her movements. I know I have no right to come here. I know what you must think of anyone associated with Mr. Hartwell at this point. Say what you came to say, Abigail said. Dora looked around once, a quick nervous scan of the road she'd come in on, then looked back. He knows about the attorney in Helena, she said. He has a contact at the telegraph office. He saw the wire you sent requesting confirmation of the appointment. Abigail went very still. He's going to move on the private note before Carver arrives, Dora said. He's filing the demand notice on Monday. That gives you 30 days instead of the 60 on the bank note, and the demand notice comes before the bank deadline, so if you can't cover it, she stopped. He'll foreclose on the private note, and the land transfers to him before any attorney can build a case. Monday. It was Saturday afternoon. Why are you telling me this? Abigail said. Dora looked at her hands. Because I've worked for that man for 9 years, she said, and I've typed his contracts, and I've filed his notices, and I've known what those terms meant to the people receiving them, and I have said nothing. She looked up and her eyes were dry, but only because she was working hard to keep them that way. My sister and her husband lost their farm in Yellowstone County 5 years ago. Different man, same scheme. I didn't understand what it was then. I understand now. She met Abigail's gaze. I won't be the one who files that notice on Monday. I quit this morning. But someone else will file it by noon if you don't do something before then. Abigail's mind was already moving. Saturday afternoon. Carver was a fortnight out. The bank deadline was 3 weeks. But the private note demand filed Monday would trigger a 30-day clock that expired before either of those. The original lending agreement, Abigail said. Hartwell has it. Do you know where? Dora hesitated. His office safe, she said. Top drawer of the filing cabinet beside the safe has a copy filed under Property Documents Thornfield. She paused. I've seen it. The demand clause is in paragraph 7. But there's also a notation in paragraph 9 that no demand may be filed during an active legal dispute if the borrower has initiated formal proceedings. She looked at Abigail. If you can file a complaint with the territorial court before Monday noon, even a preliminary one, even without Carver present, the demand clause is stayed until the dispute resolves. Abigail stared at her. How do you know that? She said. Because I typed that contract too, Dora said. Hartwell thought that paragraph was protection for him. It means he can't be sued while collecting. But it works both ways. If you file first, he can't collect while being sued. The silence stretched for 3 full seconds. The territorial court is in Grover's Bend, Abigail said. Judge Alderman. He holds Saturday hours until 4 o'clock. It's 2:30, Dora said. Abigail was already moving toward the house. Evie, she called. Evie, get your bonnet. She drove the wagon herself, pushing the horses harder than she liked, Evie sitting rigid and wide-eyed beside her holding the side rail. Where are we going? Evie asked. To see a judge, Abigail said. Why? To file a complaint before a man who wants to take our home can stop us. Evie considered this for exactly 4 seconds. Can he do that? Stop us. Not if we get there first, Abigail said. Evie held on tighter. Then go faster, she said. Abigail went faster. She pulled up to the courthouse at 10 minutes to 4 and went up the steps at a pace that was just short of running Evie's hand in hers. The clerk at the front desk looked up and started to say the office was closing, and Abigail said, I need to file a preliminary complaint of predatory lending and contract fraud against Cyrus Hartwell, and I need to do it in the next 10 minutes. And the look on her face was apparently clarifying because the clerk stood up and led her directly to Judge Alderman's office without another word. Alderman was a heavy-set man in his 60s who looked annoyed at the interruption right up until the moment he heard Hartwell's name. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at her with the particular expression of a man who had been waiting for something and wasn't sure he was looking at it, but was willing to find out. Sit down, Mrs. Thornfield, he said. She sat. Evie sat beside her, perfectly still, hands folded. Abigail laid it out. Short, direct, in order: the private note, the demand clause, Ruth's document, the 7 witnesses, Dora Sinclair's information, the Monday filing. She put Thomas's letter on the desk because it was the only original document she had on her person. Alderman read it. He read it twice. You have an attorney coming from Helena, he said. Franklin Carver. He confirmed by letter. Alderman looked at Thomas's letter again. He looked at Abigail. He looked briefly at Evie, who was watching him with the steady, unblinking attention she gave to things she thought were important. I'll stamp a preliminary filing, he said. It establishes date and intent. It won't win you the case, but it activates the stay provision you described, assuming the contract language holds what you say it holds. He picked up his stamp. Carver will need to formalize this within 30 days. He'll be here in 2 weeks, Abigail said. Alderman stamped the document. The sound of it in that quiet office was one of the most satisfying sounds Abigail had ever heard in her life. He handed her the copy. She took it with steady hands. Mrs. Thornfield, Alderman said as she stood, Hartwell is going to know about this by Sunday morning. I know, she said. He's not going to be happy. No, she said. He's not. Alderman looked at her with something that was not quite admiration and not quite sympathy, but was somewhere between the two. You've got some nerve, he said. I'll give you that. My husband always said it was my worst quality, she said. Something moved in Alderman's face. Might be your best one, he said. She walked out of the courthouse into the late afternoon sun with Evie's hand in hers and the stamped filing in her coat, and the full knowledge that she had just kicked the hornet's nest in the most direct way possible. Hartwell would know by morning. Morrison would come again. It would get worse before it got better. She looked down at Evie. Did we win? Evie asked. We bought time, Abigail said. That's not the same as winning. Evie thought about that. But it's better than losing. Yes, Abigail said. It is considerably better than losing. They climbed back into the wagon. The horses were tired, and so was she, and it was 4 miles home, and Nathaniel didn't know any of what had just happened, and the summer was not done with them yet. But the clock that Hartwell had been running had just stopped. And for the first time in this long, brutal summer, it was Abigail Thornfield's hand on the watch. Nathaniel was in the yard when she pulled in, and he came to the wagon before she'd stopped the horses. He took one look at her face and said, What happened? She handed him the stamped filing without a word. He read it in the last light of the afternoon. She watched him get to the bottom, then start again at the top, then stop and look up at her. You filed on Hartwell, he said. Before he could file on me, she said. We had a window of about 90 minutes. We used it. He looked at Evie, who was climbing down from the wagon with the careful dignity of someone who had participated in something important and knew it. She drove very fast, Evie reported. I can see that, Nathaniel said. He looked back at Abigail. Something moved across his face that she had no clean name for. It was relief and worry, and something else running underneath both of them, something warmer and more complicated than either. Hartwell will know by morning, he said. That's what the judge said, Abigail said. I expect Morrison by noon. Nathaniel folded the document and handed it back to her. Then we'd better be ready, he said. Yes, she said. We had better. She went inside and put the filing in the desk drawer where Thomas's letter had been, and she stood there for a moment with her hand flat on the desk, and she said out loud quietly to the empty room, I'm still here, Thomas, and I'm keeping it. The desk didn't answer, but she felt better for having said it. Morrison came at 10 in the morning, not noon. He came with 2 men this time, not the young one with the rifle, but 2 older men, harder-faced, the kind of men who rode for Hartwell because the work paid and the questions were discouraged. He came with a document in his hand and a look that was past the stage of friendly intimidation and into something flatter and more purposeful. Nathaniel was on the porch when the 3 of them rode in. He didn't step off it. He stood with his arms at his sides and waited. Abigail came out behind him. Morrison pulled up and looked at the filing in his hand and then at Abigail. This won't hold, he said. The warmth was completely gone from his voice now. Whatever you think you filed yesterday, Hartwell's attorneys are all ready. The stay provision is in paragraph 9 of the original lending agreement, Abigail said, which means Hartwell wrote it himself, which means his attorneys were the ones who put it there, which means they know exactly what it says. She held his gaze. He can't file the demand notice while an active legal dispute is in the territorial court. Judge Alderman stamped it at 3:54 yesterday afternoon. Morrison looked at her for a long moment. One of the men behind him shifted in his saddle. You've made a serious enemy, Morrison said. I had a serious enemy before I knew his name, Abigail said. He burned my barn, Mr. Morrison. He sent a preacher to my door to warn me off. He loaned money to my husband under terms designed to fail. She took one step forward. I am not afraid of him, and I want you to tell him that personally. Morrison's jaw tightened. He looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel said nothing. He just looked back. There was a long, taut silence in which everyone on that porch and in that yard understood exactly where the lines were drawn. Then Morrison turned his horse, and the 3 of them rode out. Nathaniel waited until they were off the property. Then he let out a long, controlled breath. He'll go straight back to Hartwell, he said. Good, Abigail said. Let him. Nathaniel turned and looked at her, and for just a second, the control in his face slipped, and what was underneath it was something raw and honest and unmistakably proud. You've changed, he said, since I first knocked on that door. She looked at him. I was always this way, she said. I just got too tired to remember it for a while. He nodded once, slowly, like that made sense in a way that meant something to him personally. They went back inside. There was work to do. Franklin Carver arrived from Helena on a Thursday, 12 days after his letter, which was 2 days earlier than expected, and which Abigail chose to take as a sign that the universe was for once running on her schedule. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-40s, with a direct manner and the kind of eyes that processed information fast and gave very little away in return. He came with a leather satchel and a junior associate named Ellis, who wrote everything down in a small notebook with the focused intensity of someone who understood that details won cases. He sat at Abigail's kitchen table for 3 hours on that Thursday afternoon. He read Thomas's letter. He read Ruth Henderson's document. He read the copy of Dora Sinclair's account which Abigail had written out from memory the night after Dora's visit, and had Dora sign the following day when she'd ridden into town to find her. He looked at the stamped court filing. He looked at the list of 7 witnesses. He didn't speak for a long time when he was done reading. Then he said, "Mrs. Thornfield, in 9 years of taking cases against predatory lenders, I have never had a client walk in with this much documentation before I asked for it." "I had good help," Abigail said. Carver looked at Nathaniel, who was sitting at the far end of the table with his coffee and his quiet manner. "Mr. Blackwood." "Mr. Carver," Nathaniel said. "You identified the pattern across multiple families," Carver said. "Mrs. Thornfield identified it," Nathaniel said. "I just rode where she told me to ride." Carver looked between the two of them with the brief noticing expression of a man who understood more than what he'd been told and had the wisdom to leave it alone. "The demand clause," Carver said, turning back to his papers, "combined with the systematic targeting of borrowers in financial distress, the intentional use of complex language, and the pattern across at least 6 ranch families and potentially mill workers, this is not a civil matter. This is fraud. Potentially criminal fraud." He set down his pen. "I'm going to need to bring in the territorial district attorney. This is larger than a contract dispute." Abigail sat very still. "Criminal," she said. "Criminal," Carver confirmed. "Hartwell isn't just a hard businessman. He's been running a coordinated scheme to dispossess landowners by design. The fire at your barn, if we can tie it to Morrison, and with 3 witnesses who saw his visit 2 days prior, we have grounds to try that's arson in furtherance of fraud." He looked at her. "Are you prepared for this to get very public?" "It already burned my barn," Abigail said. "It's been public since then." Carver almost smiled. "Good," he said. "I'll send for the district attorney tomorrow. In the meantime, the stay on your private note holds, and I'm going to file an emergency motion to extend your bank deadline on the basis of active litigation." He picked up his pen again. "Hartwell is not going to have a comfortable autumn." For the first time in months, Abigail Thornfield felt something in her chest that was simply cleanly relief. The twist that none of them had planned for came the following Monday morning, and it didn't come from Hartwell. It came from Pike Morrison. He rode up alone, no men behind him, no document in his hand, just himself, on a tired horse, looking like a man who had spent the weekend making a decision he wasn't sure was right and had made it anyway. Nathaniel met him in the yard. Abigail came out behind him. Morrison didn't meet either of their eyes right away. He held his hat in both hands and he said, "I need to speak with the attorney." Abigail stared at him. "Carver," Morrison said. "I know he's here. Word got around." He finally looked up, and he looked like a man carrying something he'd been carrying too long. "I didn't set the fire," he said. "I want to be clear about that first. I didn't do it, and I didn't order it. That was Hartwell's doing direct. He sent 2 men I don't know. And I need to—" He stopped, started again. "I've been working for Hartwell for 6 years. I've carried his messages and made his threats, and I have told myself it was business." He looked at Abigail. "It wasn't business. It was what it was. And I'm not going to stand in front of a court and lie for a man who burns women's barns." Nobody spoke for a moment. "You'll testify," Abigail said. "Against Hartwell," Morrison said. "Yes." He said it like it cost him something, and he was paying it anyway. "I know what that means for me in this county. I know I'll never work here again. But I've got a wife and 2 daughters, and I'm not going to—" He stopped again. His jaw worked. "I'm not going to be the kind of man my daughters think is fine." Nathaniel looked at Morrison for a long time. Then he said, "Come inside. I'll get Carver." Morrison looked at him. This man he'd faced down in the yard 3 weeks ago. This man he'd brought a rifle-armed associate to intimidate, and he nodded. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. Abigail stepped aside and let him in.
Talk to Mag.
Carver met with Morrison for 2 hours. Ellis filled pages. When they came out, Carver's expression was the most readable it had been since he arrived, the controlled professional equivalent of a man who had just drawn 4 aces and was working hard not to show it. "He knows the names of the 2 men who set the fire," Carver said to Abigail quietly in the hallway. "And he has documentation records he kept personally of instructions Hartwell gave him in writing over the years. He kept them because he thought they might matter someday." He paused. "They matter." Abigail looked through the kitchen doorway at Morrison, who was sitting at her table with a cup of coffee staring at nothing, looking like a man who had just put something down that had been breaking his back and wasn't sure yet if his spine would straighten. "What happens now?" she asked. "The district attorney arrives Wednesday," Carver said. "With Morrison's testimony and the records he's carrying, Hartwell will be looking at formal charges inside 30 days. He looked at her. "Your property is protected. The bank deadline gets extended. I'm filing that motion today. The private note is stayed indefinitely pending criminal proceedings." He paused. "You should know when a fraud case of this size goes through the court, typically voids the fraudulent contracts entirely, which means the private note Hartwell holds against your property may be ruled invalid from the start." Abigail absorbed that. "Thomas's debt," she said quietly, "may not be legally enforceable," Carver said. "If the terms were predatory and deliberately obscured, the contract fails." She stood still with that for a moment. The weight of it, the thing Thomas had been carrying and hadn't told her and had died carrying, might not have been real. Might have been something Hartwell invented and dressed up in legal language and handed to a struggling man in a bad season and called a loan. She felt something move through her that was grief and fury and an exhausted, complicated kind of grace. "Thomas didn't know," she said. "No," Carver said. "He didn't." She nodded once, went back to the kitchen, poured herself a coffee, and stood at the window and breathed. Evie came in from the back door with the egg basket and stopped when she saw the room full of people. "Is it good or bad?" she asked, looking at Abigail. "Good," Abigail said. Evie looked at Morrison, who was still at the table. She looked at him for a long, serious moment. "You were one of the bad ones," she said. Not unkindly, just accurately. Morrison looked at the little girl. "I was," he said. "Are you trying to be better?" Evie asked. Morrison's throat moved. "Yes, miss," he said. "I am." Evie nodded. "Okay then," she said, and went to put the eggs on the counter. The territorial district attorney arrived on Wednesday, as promised, a brisk woman named Judge Hester Vance, who had the look of someone who had seen every variety of human dishonesty and was no longer surprised by any of it, but remained offended on principle. She reviewed the case, interviewed witnesses over 2 days, and on Friday morning issued a formal arrest warrant for Cyrus Hartwell on charges of contract fraud, predatory lending conspiracy to commit arson, and 3 additional counts that Carver's associate Ellis read out from his notebook in a voice that tried and mostly failed to remain neutral. Harlan County's sheriff served the warrant at Hartwell's house on Friday afternoon. Abigail heard about it from Walt Pruitt, who rode out specifically to tell her which she thought was one of the finest things anyone had done for her in years. She was standing in the yard when Nathaniel came out of the barn and saw her face and said, "Tell me." "They arrested him," she said, "an hour ago." Nathaniel stood still. The afternoon light came down on the yard and on the barn that was standing now, its damaged wall repaired over 2 weekends of community work, taller and stronger than the original, because Bauer had brought better lumber, and nobody had been willing to rebuild it weak. "It's over," Nathaniel said. "The criminal part is starting," she said. "But the part where he could take this land, yes, that's over." Nathaniel took his hat off and held it in both hands, the same gesture she'd noticed on that very first morning when he'd stood on her porch, not knowing if she'd send him away. She'd thought then that it might be nerves or might be habit. Now she knew it was neither. It was the thing he did when something mattered enough that he needed his hands to be still. "Nathaniel," she said. He looked at her. "I want to say something, and I want you to let me finish it," she said. He nodded. "When you knocked on my door," she said, "I was 52 days from losing everything, and I didn't know it yet. I thought I knew how bad it was, and I was wrong. It was worse. Thomas had kept things from me, not to deceive me, but because he was ashamed and afraid, and that shame had built a wall between us in the last years that I hadn't known how to climb over." She stopped, steadied herself. "I was grieving a man I loved, and also a marriage that had gone quiet in ways that hurt, and I didn't have anyone to say that to because the only person I'd ever said hard things to was in the ground." She held his gaze. "You came, and you worked, and you asked nothing, and you stood in the yard against Morrison, when you had no obligation to, and you put your savings on my kitchen table, and you rode to neighbors you'd never met, and you did all of that without making me feel like I owed you anything for it." Her voice stayed level. "I need you to know that I see it. All of it. I see you." The yard was very quiet. Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. "Abigail," he said, and the way he said her name was different from every other time, not careful, not measured, just open. "I came here because I needed work." That part was true. He paused. "But I stayed because of you. Not the ranch, not the situation. You." He turned his hat once in his hands. "I know the timing is. I know it's not simple. You've been through loss and so have I, and we're both people who learn to be careful." He looked at her directly. "But I'd like to stop being careful if you're willing." She looked at him for a moment that stretched long enough to mean something. "Ask me," she said. He took one step toward her. "Will you let me court you properly?" he said. "Not because of the ranch or the work or what we've been through together, just because I'd like to know you past all of it, past the crisis and the fear and the deadlines. Another step. The way you actually are, the way you were before all this." "I don't know if I remember who that was," she said. "Then we find out together," he said. She looked at this man, the lines of work in his face, the steadiness in his eyes, the hat turning slowly in his hands, and she felt the wall that grief had built around her heart, the one she'd been so careful to maintain, give way in the manner of things built under prolonged pressure, not shattering, but settling, coming down slow and permanent and without regret. "Yes," she said. "I'm willing." He stopped turning his hat. The smile that moved across his face was not large, but it was the kind that meant something had come home. 3 weeks later on a Sunday, that was just beginning to hint at the first cool edge of autumn coming down from the north, Evie found them sitting on the porch after supper. Abigail in the rocking chair, Nathaniel on the step beside her, close enough to be unambiguous, and she stood in the doorway with her cloth rabbit under one arm and looked at them both with that precise measuring gaze. "Papa," she said. "Evie," he said. "Are we staying?" she asked. "For real staying. Not just until the work is done." Nathaniel looked at Abigail. Abigail looked at Evie. "For real staying," Abigail said. "If you want." Evie thought about it for exactly the amount of time it took her to confirm what she'd already decided. "I want," she said. She looked at the yard, at the barn, at the chicken pen where Gertrude and her 6 companions had settled in for the evening. "Can I have a dog?" she asked. "One thing at a time," Nathaniel said. "That means yes eventually." Evie told her rabbit and went back inside. Nathaniel shook his head slowly, and Abigail laughed, really laughed for the first time, the full and unguarded kind she'd been holding back since spring, and the sound of it went out into the cooling evening air and didn't have anywhere to be except right there on the porch of the Thornfield Ranch in the first autumn after the hardest summer. 6 months later, when Franklin Carver wrote to inform her that the territorial court had voided all of Hartwell's private notes on grounds of systematic fraud, and that Cyrus Hartwell had accepted a plea arrangement that included restitution to every family he'd defrauded. Abigail read the letter at the kitchen table, where she'd read so many letters that had tried to take things from her. Nathaniel was at the stove. Evie was outside feeding the chickens, and as of 3 weeks prior, a brown and white dog named Corporal who had shown up in the yard and refused to leave, and whom Evie had declared was already theirs before anyone had agreed to it. Abigail read the letter twice. She folded it carefully and set it down. "It's done," she said. Nathaniel turned from the stove. "All of it," he said. "All of it," she said. "The notes are voided. The families keep their land. Hartwell's assets are seized to cover restitution." She looked up. "Ruth Henderson gets her farm back. Clara's son keeps his job. The Mallorys get compensated." She paused. "Thomas's debt is gone. It was never legal." Nathaniel set down what he was holding and came to the table and looked at her. She looked back at him, this man who had knocked on her door in the worst summer of her life, with nothing but a reference letter and a little girl in a crooked bonnet and 12 years of honest work in his hands. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he closed his around hers without hesitation, the way people held on when they knew what they had and intended to keep it. Outside, Evie's voice drifted through the kitchen window, explaining something to Corporal, with the patient authority she brought to all things, the same voice that had once talked a hostile chicken into cooperation, and had looked a grown man in the eye and asked him if he was trying to be better, and had asked if they were staying with a directness that made complicated things simple. Harlan County would remember the summer of 1878 for a long time: the fire, the trial, the fall of Cyrus Hartwell's empire. But what the Thornfield Ranch would remember was simpler and more durable than all of it. That the worst season had brought the best thing, that the knock on the door that should have meant desperation had meant rescue, and that the woman who had stood in the dirt above her husband's grave and told herself she would not cry anymore had found in the end that the life that came after the grief was not a lesser one. It was simply the next one, and it was hers.